Thank you for joining us for this New York City Facade Ordinance presentation. Today we'll be talking about FISP, or the Facade Inspection Safety Program in New York City. Today is August 10th, 2020. Everything that we're going to talk about here we know to be true and accurate as of today. It's a dynamic rule that is continually changing to improve for the betterment of the public safety. So rules will change. Keep in touch with us, reach out, ask any questions if you're concerned about any changes that may have occurred after today. So from here, we're hoping to keep this presentation at about an hour. Sometimes I run a little bit long. I'll talk pretty fast in the middle of it because some of it is a little bit more technical and less important. This presentation is meant for owners and property managers, directors of facilities. So we're trying to keep it at that level and stay out of some of the technical that really just the engineers and architects need to be concerned about, but giving you the information that you need to represent your buildings appropriately. With that, we'll move into the presentation. Thank you. I am Brian Sullivan, the principal and founder of Sullivan Engineering. Been in this industry for about 20 years. We focus exclusively on exterior restorations of buildings on the Northeast, but mostly in the New York City area. This is just a quick overview of our team. You may know some of them: Mike Freck, Kevin Duffy, Mike Lopez, Tom Kadari, a couple of our directors that started with us recently. So rolling out a little bit about the rest of our team, just to give you an idea of who we are. Again, we are focused exclusively on exterior restoration, the engineering for exterior restoration. The agenda for today, we're going to discuss the recent changes in the 9th cycle of this facade ordinance. First, we'll go through those changes, what has changed, and then as we go through the rest of the presentation, we'll highlight those changes in green so that you're aware of what's new as opposed to what's was there before, what's different in this 9th cycle now that we're some 40 some odd years into the rule. Those changes will be highlighted in a green font as we go through, so it's clear for you what's different. So if you're familiar with FISP, you pay attention to the first 5 or 6 slides, and then after that, you can go and drift off and not have to pay attention for the rest of the presentation. If this is new for you, you'll get an idea of what's new right now, as well as the history of the facade ordinance. Then we're going to jump into the why FISP is there, the what of FISP, the when, and the how. We'll discuss the specific requirements for FISP, and then at the end, we'll go over some frequently asked questions that have come up. This is about the 6th or 7th time we've done this webinar, so some questions have come up at the end. We'll go through those frequently asked questions. For anyone who's unaware, there is an amnesty program right now. If you're involved with a building that did not file an 8th cycle FISP report, you may file a 9th cycle report early during June to September of 2020. It is possible they'll extend that September deadline, but they haven't said that yet. I've just heard that through the grapevine. The DOB has not released they'll extend it beyond the end of September. But so what do we mean by that? If your building was supposed to file in cycle 8B or cycle 8C, you may file early during cycle 9A. We'll get into those a little bit later, but if you're familiar with it, you can file during 9A only during June and September. Why would you want to do that? So your building, if you didn't file in the 8th cycle, you're supposed to, is accruing violations. You may not have received that yet, but you're accruing monthly violations and yearly violations. If you don't file in the amnesty program, you would have to wait until 9B or 9C and then continue to accrue those violations. So you can kind of stop that now. And of course, the spirit of the FISP program is to protect the public. So the sooner you have your report done, your inspection performed, your report filed, in theory, then you're moving to protect the public and meet your requirements to maintain your building safe. The recent changes for the 9th cycle. We always want to know why. Why were there so many changes between the 8th and the 9th cycle? And here's a quote from a DOB publication that came out to those of us in the industry. It said, recent inspections have revealed significant deficiencies in facade compliance reporting by registered design professionals. Therefore, the department is enhancing the qualified exterior wall inspector qualifications, the inspection requirements, and the civil penalties against owners to ensure public safety. So what does that mean? It means that, you know, when they went back and looked at some things that happened, there's been a lot of incidents in the last 5 years And they went back to audit it and kind of speak to the professionals that were involved in the inspections. They realized that people weren't really following the rules. And when they were, maybe the rules weren't stringent enough. So what did they do? They stepped up the qualifications for what's called a qualified exterior wall inspector. It used to be that you had to have 1 year of experience in our niche and a licensed PE or RA to qualify for that. Now they want 7 years, right? So that's much better, as this is a very subjective rule. The inspection requirements, how frequently along the building, the perimeter of the building we have to do the inspections, has stepped up significantly. It used to be that you could just do one drop in one location. Now it's 60 feet on center. And then the civil penalties have become much more stringent. So building owners, as well as the property managers, facilities managers, should be aware of that, because costs for these inspections are going to go up significantly. By way of the engineer or architect's cost, the contractor's cost for the scaffolding or the access, as well as penalties, if penalties should be assessed. So what are those specifically? The QE, as I just mentioned, is required to have at least 7 years of relevant experience. When QE first came out, that designation, those of us that were in the industry and had filed many reports with the DOB in the past, we were grandfathered in automatically based on our experience and based on the DOB's experience with us and their comfort level with our knowledge of the rule. Anyone after that had to show that they had at least 1 year of relevant experience, had to provide their resume to the DOB, and then sit for an oral exam. Now they want 7 years of experience documented, as well as the license for PE or RA designation, and then sit for the oral exam with the DOB's FISP team. So it is, in my opinion, really good that they're doing that. They're stepping up the requirements. As we'll get into later, it's a very subjective inspection process. Close-up inspections is at 60 feet on center or less. Again, it used to be one drop on one elevation is what was required. The engineer and architect could state that they wanted to do more. Now it's a minimum of 60 feet on center or less, or I should say a maximum, right? And then probes to verify and document wall ties in cavity wall facades will be required every other cycle. So beginning in the 9th cycle, if your building is an existing building now and has to file reports, in the 9th cycle, there have to be probes in the cavity wall to see if ties are present, what those ties look like, what condition they're in right now, and whether or not they meet the code requirements. And that'll have to be done on every drop, and we're looking at probably about 3 probes per drop for a typical building. So this is going to be a little bit more of an involved endeavor to do these inspections for cavity wall buildings as we go forward. And then that's every other cycle. So it'll be the 9th cycle, 11th, 13th, and so on. And then the photo of the individual performing the close-up inspection on each drop. So when these rules came out, I looked at some of them and said, oh, that makes sense. Others, I kind of shook my head a little bit. This one I was a little miffed about, right? That they really don't believe that we're out there doing the inspections. And they want us, what I call it the selfie rule, right? They want us to take a selfie when we're out there doing the inspection. And then I learned that that's exactly what happened. There were some engineers or architects who were just having the contractor do the inspection for them. And then some catastrophes occurred. And when the DOB questioned them on it, they admitted that they had never been to the building. That is obviously not part of the spirit of the rules, not part of the law. So now to prove that the engineer or architect was there, they want a photo of that individual on site doing the up-close inspection. So again, when you learn the why, you kind of understand a little bit better why some of these rules were put in place, or the justification behind them, right? Recommended time frame to resolve unsafe conditions must be included in the report. More than 5 years will not be accepted. When this first came out, several of us in the industry were talking, we're saying, well, I thought we always had to do that. Well, apparently the way the law was written, you could just state immediate, and a date didn't have to be put in to the report. All of us were putting dates in anyway, all that I know in the industry, but apparently some weren't. They were just putting immediate. And then building owners could debate in court what was immediate, right? That's the definition of the term immediate. So now they want a date for unsafe conditions. Monthly civil penalties for unsafe conditions are going to accrue and increase annually at a linear rate that's based on the length of the sidewalk bridge, right? So those civil penalties used to be standard regardless of the size of the building. Well, it does kind of make sense that, a 7-story brownstone on the Upper West Side shouldn't have the same violations as, for example, the Chrysler building, right? That's a full square city block. So it makes sense. This is an easy way for them to kind of figure out how a penalty could be charged. and it's based on the length of the sidewalk bridge. The penalty to that building on the Upper West Side, that's a 7-story brownstone, really isn't going to impact the owners of the Chrysler building proportionally. So they wanted to make sure they did that. And the DOB is going to perform inspections for extension requests. So if you have unsafe conditions, you can file an extension. It used to be that we would just submit our report with some photos to the DOB, and they would either grant or deny the extension request. Now, just sending in that extension request is going to trigger an inspection to the site from the DOB to confirm that what's stated by the engineer is accurate and true. And last but not least is the notice for the lobby. So just like restaurants have a grading system, now every building in the city that falls within the universe will have to put a notice in their lobby, a certificate printed from the DOB Now system that states whether or not the building is classified as safe, unsafe, or swarm, which is safe with a repair and maintenance program. That has to be in a frame covered with glass in the lobby, clearly displayed. Talked about the inspections being at 60 feet on center or less. So I'm showing you here a building that we performed an inspection on in the 8th cycle. We did one drop as required. We had a good idea. We could see clearly the rest of the facade, the rest of the street facades, which there's 2 of them, through binoculars and from adjacent building roofs. So we did one drop. That was enough to do the inspection and see what we had to do. Now for the 9th cycle, for 60 feet on center or less, that would require 3 drops. So you can see how quickly, obviously, you're increasing your contractor's costs by going from 1 drop to 3, and you're even increasing the time for the engineer to be on site. So costs for these inspections will go up, even excluding the fact of the cavity wall. Once you add probes for cavity wall buildings, you're going up that much more. So that's the end of the discussion on recent changes for the 9th cycle. So again, if you're familiar with FISP, you can go ahead and not pay attention the rest of the way. But if you're relatively new to the industry, learning about what FISP is, or you just want a refresher about some of the stuff that came up in the past, the rest of this presentation should be beneficial to you. Just talking nationally, what is a facade ordinance and who has them, right? So a facade ordinance is a rule that governs the maintenance of facades, usually mandated by the Department of Buildings or whatever it might be called locally in that municipality. There's 12 municipalities in the United States that currently, as of today, have facade ordinances. And you can see some major cities on that. You also see some smaller cities. And if you look closely, you'll notice that cities like DC, LA, Atlanta, Seattle, even Las Vegas are not on that list. So usually what happens is these laws can get passed in a reactionary manner, right? Meaning after an incident occurs. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to get these rules passed prior to there being an incident. So that's why you see some large cities, they've been fortunate they haven't had any incidents. Most of the facade ordinances state that an inspection has to be performed for buildings 5 stories and above. New York City's happens to be that it's greater than 6 stories. So it's a huge number for New York City. Greater than 6 stories, there's over 14,000 buildings in what they call the FISP universe. If they were to take that to 5 stories and above, from what I understand, that's about 100,000 buildings in New York City that we need to have those inspections performed. There are about 70,000 buildings in 50 major metro areas in the US that do not require facade inspections, right? So outside of that number I just said, about the 86,000 in New York City that don't fall within New York City's facade ordinance, there's about 70,000 buildings. And to be honest, that research that we did is a bit old. It's over a year old since we did that. So obviously that number's gone up by now. So that's the national facade ordinance discussion. Getting back to New York City and giving you kind of a brief history. Anything we learn about, we want to learn why, right? So why is there this facade ordinance in place? Well, unfortunately, in May of 1979, Grace Gold, who was a Barnard College student, was walking down the street up near Columbia University when a 1-foot by 2-foot section of facade fell, struck and killed Grace very tragically. And that was May 1979. And then following up, Local Law 10 of 1980 became law in February. So just a few months later, they put this law in place, and that stated that either a PE or an RA, so a professional engineer or registered architect, must oversee the inspection It stated it had to be performed on street facades, but only those street facades within 25 feet of the street, and it was not, side elevations or rear elevations. It did state 5-year cycles, and those 5-year cycles still hold. So it started in 1980, and the next cycle was 85, and then 90, and so on. And a report had to be filed with the DOB. So it was a good rule to put in place. It started the process, which was great, and likely saved countless lives and certainly many, many incidents in those 40 years that the law's been in place. But it wasn't without debate when it first came out. One of the things that was debated was the word inspect. So the rule stated that you had to inspect street facades. It did not state whether or not you had to do up-close inspection or a hands-on inspection. At that time, they stated you could use binoculars and a camera with a telephoto lens. That one always makes me chuckle because we remember cameras with telephoto lenses now, and now we just use our phone, right? Our smartphone or maybe a digital camera. But that word inspect was up for debate, and it was up to the engineer or architect to decide whether or not they wanted to do an up-close inspection with the initial version of Local Law 10. Unfortunately, there's some additional incidents that occurred after Local Law 10 of 80. A few of those include in 1982, a 28-year-old lawyer was hit by a piece of a cornice that fell from a 30-story building in Brooklyn. That was in 82, just 2 years later. And if we fast forward another 15 years to 1997, there was 4 incidences in a matter of 16 days. That winter of 1997, as I remember, it was a pretty cold, harsh, windy winter. And these 16 days were particularly rough for facades in New York City. So on December 15th, a shower of bricks rained down on Madison and 55th from a 39-story office building. Go to December 30th, the facade of the 6-story Selwyn office building collapsed. On that same day, a 16-square-foot piece of the cornice parapet on the Church of Scientology building fell. And then the next day, December 31st, a chunk of stone damaged a concrete sidewalk outside the Belclair Hotel. So you have these incidences. Obviously, the public was very concerned, as they should be. So Local Law 11 of 98 was signed into law on March 13th of 1998 by Rudy Giuliani. So you first start with Local Law 10 of 1980. Now we move on, and it's Local Law 11 of 1998. And Local Law 11 stated that only exterior walls now exempt are those within 12 inches of an adjacent building, right? So you visually still had to now inspect the side walls and the rear walls of the buildings as well, and those street elevations that are even more than 25 feet back from the street. They wanted those inspected as well. So you don't have to inspect any wall that's within 12 inches of an adjacent building, which again, when you think about the spirit of the rule, which is to protect the public, that makes a lot of sense, right? There's no public within that 12-inch space. There's also very little wind and weather exposure to that wall. Local Law 11 also better outlined what was required for the engineer and architect performing the investigation. The law was much more descriptive, right? And that's often the way it is. You roll out a rule, you have 18 years of working with that rule, and you get to learn the pros and the cons and how you want to tweak it, how you want to make it better. So it's much more descriptive law. There was 3 pages of law that explained what was to be included in the report. The up-close inspection was now required for a street facade. So they required now one, what they call up-close or hands-on inspection, and that had to be straight from the ground to the top of the parapet wall of the building, the top wall of the building. And then notifications of unsafe conditions. So the DOB had to be notified of unsafe conditions. Moving along, Local Law 11 has been amended several times. And unfortunately, those times are due to tragedies that have occurred or in response to tragedies. On March 14, 2010, Connor Donahue fell from the building that he lived at, 24 stories, from his balcony on 39th and 1st. And then just going 3.5 years later, and Jennifer Rosoff fell 15 stories from the balcony railing she was sitting on, which buckled, as you can see in that photo there, at her building at 57th and 1st. So you have those 2 incidences occurring relatively close, about 3.5 years apart, and that led to the DOB increasing their focus on balcony railings. If you were in the industry in 2014, you'd remember that we were running around, many of us, re-inspecting the buildings we were working on. To be fair, balconies and parapets balcony railings, parapets are considered appurtenances of the building. So we were looking at them, but maybe not through the lens that now we had to as part of a little bit of a modification to the rule and, you know, the incidents that occurred here. So we had to run around, do load tests on some of these balcony railings, measure the height, measure the spacing for the railings themselves to make sure they met the code requirements, and then check the overall condition of them. So we were running around looking at the balconies, and then from there on now, we've all done it as we're doing parts of the inspections. But January 2014, the cycle had already ended for the previous FISP rule, or what was Local Law 11 at the time. So we had to run back out and look at a lot of these buildings to make sure we're satisfied. Now that's part of the standard operating procedure. So unfortunately, then you also have in May of 2015, very sadly, Greta Green, a young 2-year-old, was killed while walking with her grandmother past a building on 74th and West End Avenue. We went out for a nice walk. From what I understand, sat on a bench below that windowsill that you see there when that chunk of terracotta fell and struck and killed poor little Greta. At that time, there was a lot of talk that the DOB was going to change the rules for terracotta buildings and require 100% hands-on inspections of all terracotta. That hasn't happened just yet, but I would anticipate that that will happen. Terracotta has a very different failure mechanism than most of the other materials we deal with. If you think of brick or concrete, that's kind of a progressive failure. You see a little hairline crack develop, that crack gets longer, gets wider, water gets in, freeze thaw, and you have years, if not decades, of that crack growing and getting wider before an unsafe condition could potentially occur. When you look at terracotta, you may have a micro fracture on the exterior, but behind that is a much larger failure that's going on. And then all of a sudden, one day, that piece lets loose when you really haven't had much time to see visual evidence of what's going on. Terracotta is really important to get your hands on it, to kind of sound it, really see what's going on in order to know what's happening with it. December 7th, 2015, a brick veneer fell 35 stories from a building on the corner of 64th and 1st. Thankfully, nobody was seriously hurt. You can kind of see it in that photo there on the upper right-hand side. Here's a close-up view of it. That's a very, very large panel of brick that fell, and we're very fortunate that nobody was seriously hurt here in New York City. If you look at the section of brick that's missing, it's very difficult to tell whether or not there was wall ties in that area. Certainly, the area with the brick above, you can't tell at all visually, right? So that's part of the understanding of why the DOB wants probes performed. They want to see whether or not these wall ties are placed, whether or not they're the right spacing, even the right wall tie to meet code. May 11, 2018, brick veneer fell 20 stories from a building on 57th and 1st. The reason we have this picture here is if you look in the top portion of this photo, you can see the bottom of the sidewalk bridge. Those posts in the background there are the sidewalk bridge. So I think many of us kind of get this false sense of security when a sidewalk bridge is put up, and we say, okay, good, the bridge is up. Yes, it is maintaining public safety for those walking under the bridge, unless there's a major catastrophe, right? But it will maintain the public safety there. But look at all that brick that's out in the street. So the foreground of that photo is the street. That much brick either bounced off of the sidewalk bridge or just projected out from the building as it fell 20 stories. So I bring this up just to remind everybody that's involved that having a sidewalk bridge in place doesn't always solve our woes of the unsafe conditions. Moving along to December of 2019, and our friend Erica Tishman was killed when she was walking to her office building in Midtown, and a section of facade debris fell and struck and killed Erica. So Local Law 10 has been great. Local Law 11 is even better as far as protecting public safety, but not all instances have been prevented. So now you see kind of a little bit more about why the 9th cycle changes are in place, and hopefully will prevent even more instances and fatalities. So now we talked about why, let's talk about what FISP is. We like our acronyms in this industry. So FISP is the Facade Inspection Safety Program. Essentially, it's Rule 10304 of the City of New York. It requires the inspection of facades every 5 years for buildings greater than 6 stories. The inspection has to be performed by a QE, a qualified exterior wall inspector. And now you can start to see where I'm highlighting in green the changes from previous cycles to the 9th cycle. So a QE now has to have 7 years of relevant experience in our niche. And the reports must be filed with the DOB within a building subcycle. So the subcycles are clearly defined. Cycle 9A is for any building that has a block number ending in 4, 5, 6, or 9. Cycle 9A falls from February 21st, 2020 to February 21st, 2022. Cycle 9B is for those buildings with a block number ending in 0, 7, or 8. And that also goes for buildings from February 21st, 2021 to 23. And then 9C is those buildings with a block number 1, 2, or 3, obviously. And that goes from 22 to 24. So that's where the subcycles are called out. Initially with Local Law 10, all the way up through the 7th cycle, everybody could file within the same 2-year filing period within that 5-year window. So there became a real backlog for the specialists in the industry, as well as for the DOB itself, because as we all know, we're all guilty of waiting to the last minute, right? Building owners, engineers, architects, all of us, we're guilty of waiting to the last minute. So all 14,000 buildings, or at that time it was 13,000 and some change, were filing within the same few month period. So to remove the backlog to the DOB and to remove and make it more efficient on the engineering and contractor side, they spread it out, I think very appropriately amongst the 3 subcycles. So those subcycles now last 4 years out of that 5-year window. So we talked about why, what, and when. Let's talk about the how for FISP. How is it performed? So buildings are classified in 3 categories: either safe, unsafe, or SWARP, safe with repair and maintenance program. If your building has one unsafe condition on it, just simply one, the entire building is classified as unsafe. If you have no unsafe conditions, but only one SWARP condition, the entire building is classified as SWARP. And if you have no unsafe conditions and no SWARP conditions, then your building is classified as safe. The recommended time frame to resolve the unsafe and SWARP conditions must be included in the report. That's greater than 5 years will not be accepted. So most of this is in green because we always knew it for SWARP. We were doing it, most of us, for the unsafe conditions as well, but apparently it wasn't clear enough in the rule that you had to provide that date. And it's important here because the building owner will sign this report. So I, the engineer, may state that, hey, this work has to be performed by August 10th, 2023. And I'm recommending that. The building owner is then signing this report stating that they agree legally to get these repairs performed before August 10th, 2023, or whatever the date might be. As I mentioned earlier, the inspections themselves are very, very subjective, right? It's in the eye of the beholder. So that's one of the reasons I really like the fact that they've taken it from 1 year to 7 years, although it makes it a little harder as a business owner to try to have those people that have that 7 years of experience. We have some great people on our team who have quite a bit of experience, but actually doing the FISP inspections, they don't have the 7 years, right? They've been in the industry for a long time, but they weren't doing inspections. So that makes a little bit of a challenge, but for what we're trying to do and protect the public, I think it really makes a lot of sense. If I talk through an example here, if I were to go out and look at a building and see a vertical crack and determine that I think that repair is swamped with a classification of 3 years. It needs to be repaired within the next 3 years. That's how I might look at it. Someone else might look at that and say, well, I think that's safe. It's fine. It's not going to become unsafe within the next 5 years. So no big deal. We don't have to cite that in the report. Someone else might look at it and say, oh, wow, there's a crack there. You know, it's an unsafe condition. It has to be addressed immediately. So what are the problems for that, right? The person that went to one extreme and said that it's safe, well, what happens if 4 years down the road, that crack has progressed so far that now it causes a brick to fall from the building, or if it's terracotta, right, and that terracotta piece falls from the building and there's an incident? Well, the building owner isn't safe just because their engineer said that this was safe, right? The engineer is going to be in a lot of hot water, but so is the building owner, because building owners by code are required to maintain their buildings as safe. So although we might be in hot water, whoever the engineer was who called that out, so will the building owner be, because they're responsible for it, right? And if you go the other way, and if somebody says it's unsafe when really it's not an unsafe condition, what happens in that situation? Well, the building owner has to go put up a sidewalk bridge, get construction started right away. They may not have the budget in place to do that. So what are they going to do? They're going to cut back on it. Maybe they're only going to do the unsafe conditions, but not do some of the smart conditions that they would have otherwise done if they could have waited 2 or 3 years and budgeted for the work. They're going to pay more for it, and perhaps in the long run, not properly protect the public the way they would if they had 3 years to plan for the project. What are we supposed to do when we're out there? We have to identify when the repairs must be completed by. I stated that already. The repair that's needed: brick replacement, mortar repointing, stone patch. The suspected reason for the deficiency. Is it simply age and weathering, or is it that there's a structural column that we think behind there that might be rusting, causing this failure to occur? And then lastly is the location of each condition based on the window line and the floor. I want to run through these 4 items and why they're so important, that they're very specific. So in theory, if you're going to work with Sullivan Engineering on your 9th cycle report, we would love for you to work with us on the 10th and 11th cycle. But we realize that doesn't always happen, right? So the more specific we are in our 9th cycle report, the easier it is for you to take that report to somebody else, either to develop the plans for the restoration or just to do the 10th cycle report later on. So the more specific we are for you, the better tool it is to give you that freedom and flexibility to go work with whoever you want to for the 10th cycle. Again, hopefully it's us, but we recognize it might not be for whatever reason. So giving that specific date of when the repairs are completed by is important. And the repair needed, right? What did we look at it? Did we see that vertical crack can just be handled by, a patch repair and a stone, or does that entire stone have to be replaced? Is it just mortar repointing that has to be done, or is it brick replacement? The suspected reason for the deficiency, if it's just age and weathering, well, that's going to progress at a typical timeline. But if it's a steel column or a steel beam that's rusting, well, that failure is going to may occur pretty quickly, right? And then the location for each condition. So if I went out and looked at this building and I said, hey, there's deteriorated mortar on the west elevation, or even if I said west elevation 9th floor, when you're reading the report, that sounds good. But if you're the next engineer coming along and you see deteriorated mortar at the west elevation on the 9th floor, you're not sure whether or not that's the same deteriorated mortar that I saw 5 years ago, or if it's new. And you have no choice then to say that that's an unsafe condition categorically, right? You don't know whether or not it was resolved. So if I say west elevation 9th floor, the building owner can have that work repaired. Someone else comes along later on and says west elevation 9th floor, sees another condition. They don't know which condition it was, right? So it's really best to say 3rd window from the south on the west elevation, and even have a photo of that deteriorated condition. The more specific it is, the better a tool it is for the building owner later on. The inspection, what do we have to do? We have to take photos. We have to take photos of all facade elevations, the main entrance with the address visible, all bulkhead elevations, and any damaged or deteriorated items. We want to take pictures of each and every one that we see to the best extent we possibly can, and try to include all of those in the report. Again, it's better for the DOB so they understand what we were looking at when they're reviewing it. It's better for the building owner so they fully understand the conditions. And then it's best for the next engineer or architect coming along to have all of those photos. And then in green, I have there the photo of the individual performing the close-up inspection on each drop. Close-up inspections at 60 feet on center or less. We used to use suspended scaffolds most frequently. As you see a photo of a suspended scaffold there in this picture, that was the way we did it most of the time. It was very simple to go out, have a contractor hang that. We can walk back and forth on the platform, and it was conventionally the way that we went. With the close-up inspections being required at 60 feet on center or less, it's my feeling and what we've seen so far in the first 6 months of the 9th cycle, that boom lifts are going to be one of the key ways to go moving forward. What I really like about the boom lift is, unlike a suspended scaffold, you have some freedom. You're away from the facade. You can kind of pull back away from the facade, move over this way, move that way, and really look at what you want to see. You still have to do one vertical drop, but you have more freedom and you have a better perspective, in my opinion. So as long as you have street elevations and have access, the boom lift is a great way to go. Another thing that's really rising in popularity is what they call sprat, or rope access, where you rappel down the side of the building. You have a photo of Joe Contreras from our team doing an inspection on West 41st Street in the city through rope access. And again, because of the number of inspections that are required, I think rope access is going to be a really popular method moving forward as well. And we've certainly seen a large rise in interest from our clients signing for proposals for us to do it with rope access. Here's another photo looking down at Joe Contreras at this building. You can see how they kind of rappel. They have to work in a team for safety reasons. I do not do rope access inspections. My wife won't let me. That's my excuse. I think if I was younger, I might have been able to do it. Right now, I probably can't do that. I probably got to drop some weight as well before I start doing rope access inspections. But I like to use the excuse that my wife won't let me. But Joe Contreras does them. Mike Lopez on our team and several others are getting the training. Mike has the training. He's doing the inspections. Several others are getting trained. And what they tell me is that you can get a pretty good perspective as well. Not quite the same as the boom lift, but better than the suspended scaffold and being right up against the building. And it gives you a lot of freedom to move around the building. The reason I think boom lifts and Sprat are going to be much more popular is if you're doing one drop, it's more or less the same cost for Sprat versus boom lift versus suspended scaffold. But once you get out to 2, 3, 4, 5 drops on a building, it is much cheaper to use boom lifts and Sprat and much faster to get in and get out of the building as far as timeline. So you're saving costs on your contractor's access costs and you're saving costs on the engineer and architect doing it. Moving along, binoculars and a digital camera can be used for everywhere else on the building. So every 60 feet on center, you're doing some sort of a drop. Everywhere else, you're using a camera and binoculars, unless for some reason the engineer and architect feels that they need it even more frequently than 60 feet on center. Probes to verify and document wall ties in the cavity wall facades will be required every other cycle, as I mentioned. So if you're an existing building now that falls within the FISP universe, you're looking at the 9th, the 11th, the 13th cycles for those probes. This is an old handout that came out from the DOB probably 15 years ago now. I don't have the date for it, but I should. But I thought it was great, and really we should still, it's very relevant today. Window mounted air conditioning units can be very, very problematic if they're not installed properly. The DOB gave this handout out, and it shows a bracket in it, which is our favorite bracket as well. It's a pressure mounted bracket. You can install it from the inside, just gets screwed into the frame at the top, and then the bracket pushes against the facade of the building below. Last time I looked it up, it was about $30. You could order them from Home Depot or any other hardware store. They'll get delivered. The super can install it fairly easily before they put the window mounted unit in. What you can't do is put something loose like a brick, or we've seen clay pots turned upside down to support the AC unit. As you can see in that photo, those bricks aren't doing anything. The AC unit's not even sitting on it, right? The problem isn't necessarily just that that brick could fall while the window's in there, while the air conditioner is in there, or that the air conditioner isn't supported properly and would fall and rip the window out, right? What's probably more frequent is that as someone's pulling that window mounted air conditioner in, they knock that brick to the street below, or they knock that pot to below, right? That happens more frequently. Obviously, the bigger tragedy would be if the AC unit itself fell to the street below, or if it ripped the window out, right? So we don't want to see bricks. We don't want to see terracotta pots or some of the other things that we could put there that we've seen supporting window mounted air conditioner units. It's best really to have it done by the building, so you know it's done right, and with those pressure mounted brackets. You can internally attach them to the structural steel or the structure of the building, whether it's a concrete column or structural steel, but you do have to go to that structure. You can't just go to the frame of the window, and you can't even go just simply to the adjacent brick on the inside of the building if it's a brick masonry building. You do have to get to the structure, which can be really complicated and maybe doesn't have the best aesthetic appeal on the inside of the building. So if there are no external brackets on the building, we have to verify that there's something inside on the internal side tied to the structure of the building. And the way we do that is either the engineer or architect has to go out and inspect every one of those units, or we need a letter from the property manager or owner stating that someone on their team has gone on and inspected every single one of those units and is now willing to take on the liability and the risk that those were installed properly. So in our opinion, just have the exterior brackets. If you have window mounted air conditioning units, just have the exterior brackets installed. We have to check the swamp items from the previous cycle's report. I kind of flew by this quickly before, but if I'm looking at, when I'm out doing a 9th cycle inspection, I have to look at the 8th cycle report and see what swamp conditions were there that needed to be addressed or unsafe, and see and make sure that they have been addressed. If there's swamp conditions that were not addressed in the previous cycle, they automatically become unsafe. Now, historically, they become unsafe. Building would get a violation for the unsafe conditions. Now, they're also getting a $2,000 fine for allowing their swamp conditions to become unsafe, and then they get the unsafe violation as well. So it's really increasing the fines, and appropriately, right? We want people to address their swamp conditions before they become unsafe. The New York City code requires all buildings to be maintained as safe. So you really have two options. It's either safe or unsafe. That swamp, that third option, as it's written, is safe with a repair and maintenance program. So if that repair and maintenance program says that this item has to be addressed within the next 4 years, it is safe until that point. If it goes beyond 4 years, it's no longer safe. It's automatically unsafe. Conditions that we're looking for, the what, again, for FISP. Most firms have their own standards for what they're looking for. We have it for our team. We train them in what they're looking for. We have typical pictures, conditions, what the timeline looks like. Most of the firms out there have that. The DOB also came up with a glossary of visual symptoms many years ago. And they did that with some of the people that I think kind of be the forefather of this industry, the likes of like Steve Verone, Rick Lefevre, David May, Alan Epstein. Those guys who've been in the industry for a long time, they put this together way back then and gave out this facade conditions. We have the link there for you to download it if you'd like to see it. That link is, that PDF document is great if you want to get an idea of what these conditions look like when you walk around your building, what you think it might be. I should warn you, though, that the reason I have that last slide on there is because it's 228 pages. So while we may enjoy looking at it for training purposes, those of you who have so many other obligations on your mind in handling the entire building probably don't want to go through all 228 pages. So don't click on the link and hit print because you're going to eat up all the paper and toner in your printer. Unsafe conditions. So if we are out there and I identify an unsafe condition, I am legally required to notify the Department of Buildings within 48 hours. The way we have to do that is by submitting what's called a FISP-3 form via DOB Now, which is their new web portal, which we'll get into later. That FISP-3 form is simply called the notification of unsafe conditions. So I have to notify the DOB within 48 hours. In addition, I have to file that unsafe report at some point, but the DOB wisely doesn't want me to wait a couple of weeks while I put my report together, send it to the owner to review and discuss with us for a couple of weeks, send it back to us, we submit it. Maybe 6 weeks has passed now since we saw the unsafe condition and we actually submitted the report and the DOB is aware of it. So that's why that FISP-3 has to be filed within 48 hours. The owner has to install a sidewalk shed immediately, and the condition must be stabilized and repaired within 30 days of report filing. If not addressed, unsafe conditions will result in a $1,000 fine per month at minimum. You know, it's important to think about the spirit of the rule too when we're out doing our inspections. You know, sometimes I'll be out on a suspended scaffold with a contractor, a trained contractor, and I might see a chunk of concrete on a balcony ledge that's really precarious and unsafe, and you can actually just take your hand and just remove it, right? If we're thinking of the spirit of the rule, well, that's the right thing to do. Just ask the contractor to just take that right off. Safely keep it on the suspended scaffold till we get down below. Now we've removed that unsafe condition. We've made it a swamp condition. That's certainly a lot better for the public below, rather than just leaving it there, riding the suspended scaffold down to the street, going back, notifying the DOB, having a sidewalk bridge put in place, and then a contractor gets out there a couple of weeks later to address it, right? Or at best, a couple of weeks, sometimes it's a couple of months. So when we think about the spirit of the rule and you're going over this with your engineers and architects, make sure they understand what it is. There's one thing to following the letter of the law, there's another to understanding the spirit of the rule, following the letter of the law, but with the spirit that's intended. So we talked about DOB Now, right? That's the portal that's in place for filing FISP reports as well as extension of time requests. So the DOB does understand, as I mentioned before, you have 30 days for your unsafe to resolve your unsafe condition. They understand that it's impossible to retain an engineer or get proposals from an engineer or architect, retain that engineer or architect put drawings out to bid to contractors, award it to a contractor, and then have that contractor start work and finish and resolving the unsafe conditions. You can't do that in 30 days. So you can file an initial extension request, which is the FISP-1 form. That'll buy you 90 more days. Before the end of the 90 days, the engineer or architect can file a FISP-2, which is an additional extension of time request. As long as we're showing progress, then the DOB will allow those requests to keep going. We had a building back in Brooklyn back several years ago that we inherited that had a lot of unsafe conditions on it. They had a sidewalk bridge up in place when they brought us in. We put design drawings together. We were able to continue that FISP extension for years, for about a year and a half, almost 2 years really. And the DOB was fine that because we showed legitimate progress working their way around the building. Even some of that progress was just that they retained us and we were putting design drawings together. So as long as you're showing reasonable progress, the DOB understands that. Conversely, we had a client in Queens who wasn't doing anything with their building, and the DOB knew about them before we did and before we got hired. When we came into place and we submitted the initial extension request, they were hiring us, we were putting the drawings together, it was approved. But then as time went on and that owner was not moving forward with the contractor, the DOB would not have approved an extension of time request for us for that building because they were not making sufficient progress. So they will allow it as long as progress is being made. If no progress is being made, and they understand construction, they understand the normal timelines. So moving along, unsafe conditions. Once the building makes the required repairs to classify the building as safe, the QE must request permission from the DOB to remove the sidewalk shed. This is relatively new. We didn't have to do that in the past. If you don't do that now, you could get a violation from the DOB. DOB inspectors want to come out, make sure all the unsafe conditions have been resolved before a bridge is removed. Swamp conditions, as I mentioned before, safe with repair and maintenance program. The conditions include a time period in which repairs must be made before they become unsafe. Repairs must be made prior to the next report filing, and the repairs should be outlined in detail in the next report. So what we show you there is kind of the conditions. That's a screenshot of one of our reports. The conditions, whether or not a permit's required, photo number, all of that. The owner is assigning the report that states whether or not a permit is required. So if they don't pull the permit, they know, they can't say they didn't know, right? They just signed a document that states that they knew a permit was required. So it's important that building owners be aware of that. We get into the report itself. I'm going to pick up the speed here a little bit. And if you think I was talking fast before, I'm going to talk really fast for the next few slides, because this is just to give you a general idea of what's required. It starts with the executive overview, which is what I always like in any report. It's the summary of the findings and recommendations, the scope, how we did the inspection, and the conclusions and recommendations. It's typically 2 to 3 paragraphs. Just tells you how we did the inspection, what we found, and then whether the building's safe, swamp, or unsafe, and that timeline. Jumping into section A of the report is a building address, a block and lot, landmark district, special district, those types of information that they want to know. Section B is the owner information. You used to be able to just put down the property manager's name. Now they want the actual owner, the individual from the ownership company that is responsible for making sure that this work is done within the next 5 years. Part of the reason for this is what we understand is the DOB was going out to building owners and saying, hey, you didn't repair your conditions that were in your previous cycle's report. And the property manager had signed the report, and the building owner was stating that, I never saw this report. Now, the DOB is very skeptical about that, whether or not they actually saw it, but they didn't have any written proof that the owner had seen the report. We all know that, it's not always the case that it's the same property manager, either individual or company, 5 years later. And really, the property manager can't force a building to do the work. The only one that can actually force the building to do the repairs is the owner himself and choose to move forward. So they really want the liability to be on the right person and the ownership for it, if you will, no pun intended, to be on the owner of the building. Description of the building, have number of stories, height, plan dimensions, the age. The age is really important, right? Because when we talk about that example I gave before about the vertical crack in the building, that vertical crack, if it's a 70-year-old building, I might be right that it's a swamp condition that can be addressed within the next 3 years. But if that's a brand new 7-year-old building, for example, well, maybe that's an unsafe condition. Why is that crack occurring so quickly? So the age of the building is very important there. The exterior wall construction, is important for them to know as well, whether it's cavity wall, mass masonry wall, etc. Any settlement, any deterioration that has occurred since the last report was filed, the procedure in making the critical examination, was it a suspended scaffold, sprat? Moving along, the extent and location of the physical examination. If we did a suspended scaffold, who was the scaffold rigger? When we started that examination and when we finished that examination. They want it to be no more than a year ago that you started, no less than 60 days ago that you finished that examination. The report of the conditions observed. So again, this is just identifying what type of conditions, where they are, and what the classification is, and then photo numbers. Now you would have almost a photo number in almost every single condition. We shoot for that as we're putting these reports together because we think it's really the best tool then. Report of conditions observed, the water tightness of the exterior surfaces. So are there any active leaks through the facade or through the roof of the building? Any deleterious effects of the exterior appurtenances. We also have to identify now, since January 2014, the number of balconies and the number of fire escapes associated with the building. So the DOB has a good record of how many fire escapes, how many balconies are associated with each building, and then total throughout the city, how many they have to deal with. And then, what we looked at the balconies, the roof railings, the exterior fixtures, making sure that we've captured all of the exterior appurtenances on the building, and we've looked at them. And then the parapets, are they 42 inches high? Do they meet the code requirement? This becomes more and more of a challenge as the energy codes increase, right? The requirements for roofs now, you're looking at adding an additional 5, sometimes 6 inches of insulation compared to what's existing. So if you add 5 or 6 inches to the top of the roof surface, you've effectively lowered the height of the parapet by 5 or 6 inches. So many, many projects now require railings to be installed or parapet lengths to be raised up to effectively keep that 42-inch minimum. The DOB is so focused on this that they want photos of us measuring the railings or the balconies. If they look at a photo and it looks like that railing is lower than 42 inches from the photo, and they don't see us measuring it out, they'll send us back out to go take a look at it and prove to them that it's 42 inches. Causes and conditions reported as unsafe for swamp, as I mentioned before, it's very often age and weathering in New York City. Is a big problem there, but there could be other conditions, right? There could be some sort of vibration that occurred due to adjacent construction. There could be structural steel deterioration behind there, and it's important to know what that is for the person doing the inspection so that they're classifying it appropriately, and also the next person coming along to see, hey, why did the previous engineer architect suspect that failure was occurring? Status of exterior maintenance, the previous cycle a report was filed as safe, is what we're stating there, right? And what exterior repairs have been performed. So it's no longer okay to simply say all items were addressed in the previous cycle. They want us to go line by line and identify what conditions were swarmed in the previous cycle and how they were addressed. What contractor was used, or really more the engineer and architect and the work permit, the permit number, and what date that was signed off. They want it to be signed off before filing that next report. So you can see a little bit of an example there. They also want to see any open ECB violations related to the facade. They want it listed out there. Again, now everybody's clear on how many violations there are, what violations there are, and the owner has acknowledged that they're aware of that. Recommended repairs for maintenance for swamp items and the work permits that are required. Photographs and sketches have to be included. Again, we say the more the better. You can have too many for sure, but for most buildings, we think the more the better. And then the classification of the building as safe, swamp, or unsafe, and as of the date. And this is right before the QE signs and seals that report. So it's right there, clear as day, the condition and the date that last inspection was performed. Appendices, these are some of the attachments that are included at the end of the report. The location diagram, this is just a roof plan of the building on the street, showing you how close it is to the corner. If it's a 7-story townhome on in the middle of a block, the DOB may come back to us and ask for the distance to the corners, just to make sure everybody's clear that they're looking at the right building. That's also why they want the photo of the building with the address, right? They want to make sure everybody's looking at the right building. When you talk about the Chrysler building, it's pretty obvious, right? When you talk about a more standard building, well, maybe someone accidentally looked at the wrong building. They also want a key plan. So we looked at one of these before. This lays out where those scaffold drops are. So it's a much easier way than saying third window from the west on the south elevation, right? If you look at the bottom of that, you have S1, S2, S3. So S1 is the first window from the west elevation on the south. S2 is the second window, right? So anyone can come along and clearly understand what I was looking at and what I'm referencing if I cite a condition at S5, fifth floor, right? Okay, they know exactly where that is now. It's much more clear. But looking at this key plan, I want to again point out the difference in scaffold drops and what that cost could look like for an owner. So this was a building that we did on the Upper East Side in cycle 8. We did one drop. That's all that was required. We did that drop on a street elevation. Moving along to what would be required for cycle 9, we're looking at 6 drops. 3 of those would be done for a sprat, and 3 would be via suspended scaffold. For varying reasons, with what's going on up at the roof, you couldn't do all through sprat, you couldn't do all through suspended scaffold. So now you're looking at 6 drops on this building. And obviously the cost would go up significantly. You're talking at least 5 times cost for the contractor if it was all suspended scaffold, and probably at least 3 to 4 times the cost when you're going with the sprat and the combination of the suspended scaffold. So that's what would have been required. Now, fortunately, the building owner had just finished a construction project to restore all the 8 cycle conditions and get rid of any swamp and unsafe conditions. So we had been on suspended scaffolds as shown there just about everywhere on that building. So we were not responsible to have to go back and do another inspection because it was within a year. I believe on the south elevation there. It's not true to scale where that scaffold was. We just made this 60 feet on center, but we didn't have to go back to do that inspection. So as you're planning your projects and your restoration for your prior conditions, as long as everything falls within what's required there, you may want to try and have your construction performed right before the next cycle. Have that next cycle done right after your repairs are performed. Will save a lot of cost on suspended scaffold, all else being equal, right? In theory, you should just address all of your swamp conditions as soon as possible. It used to be beneficial when you only had to do 1 drop on the building to have that drop done during construction. Now it's incredibly beneficial to have that. Not the best, but they had a limited budget, right? And I think they did a great job. And it's a heck of a lot easier than using microfiche, which is what we were using prior to the 8th cycle. So it's a huge step forward. It's a work in progress. They've been fixing it. The DOB team's been really great with kind of getting back on trying to take advice and suggestions and fix it, or at least answer our questions when we have difficulties. But what has to happen here is the TR6 form, including the location information and getting the owner's info and signature, the QE's info and signature, and the filing status is right there on the DOB now, available for all the public to see. You can also pull the previous cycle's report, which makes life a lot easier since it's there. The owner must pay the filing fee of $425 through the DOB Now site. Once the fee is paid, the owner can review and approve the report. Once they do that, then the engineer or architect has to be notified so that we can then approve and submit the report to the DOB. Sometimes there's a little bit of gap in that communication, and if you're going up against a tough timeline, because you only have 60 days from your last inspection to when you have to get that submitted, you know, that can be really problematic if that communication doesn't occur. So as soon as the owner reviews and approves it, they should let us know so that we can jump on and, you know, review and submit, re-review and submit that report. Report filing must be filed within 60 days, as I mentioned before. That ensures that the information provided within the report is recent and accurate. So if we go beyond the 60 days because of a slow review process or whatever, I have to go back out to the building and look at it again before submitting. So there's a couple of things in here that as an owner or a property manager, when you're shopping for FISP inspections, you want to make sure that you understand what you're buying, right? And if Sullivan Engineering makes multiple mistakes on a report and the DOB has to review that report multiple times, well, that could be a problem, right? And if I have to go back out, or if that report gets kicked out and I have to go back out and look at that building again because it's beyond the 60 days, well, who owns that? You know, if it was my fault, then of course Sullivan Engineering would have to do that and the owner shouldn't have to pay for it. But if it's not, who's going to pay for it? And at what point are you going to get a bill for those inspections? So you clearly want to know that and get a good feel for that when you're buying those services. Additional filing fee, this goes in the same boat, right? So if the facade unit may charge an additional fee if there's multiple reviews back and forth, if they keep kicking it back to us for the same thing or multiple times, they may charge a filing fee. Now, we've never had that happen, so I don't know what triggers it for them. I know that after 2 reviews, they state that they can hit somebody with a fee. So as you're shopping for these services, again, you want to make sure you know who's going to pay that fee. If it's something that the owner's doing wrong, well, then it should be on the owner. If it's something that is new with the DOB or there's trouble with the DOB examiner, well, who's going to pay for that? And certainly if it's our fault, well, we shouldn't bill the client for it, right? So we want to make sure that's clearly understood, because these are the things that can cause a delay near the end and have you miss a filing window. And late filing is $1,000 per year. Applies for failure to file the report. So it's $1,000 a year plus $250 a month for every month that the report is late. So if you go a year, you're obviously out at, quick math tells me it's about $4,000 for the year, right? You go 3 years, you're out at $12,000. Who owns that if these reports don't get filed? Penalties for unsafe conditions. So civil penalties, as we mentioned, is $1,000 a month. And then for every foot of bridge, after year 1, it's $10 per month. When you go out to year 5, it's $1,000 per month plus $40 per shed linear foot per month. Right, so that's getting to be significant. If you have a 100 linear foot bridge, which is pretty typical, you know, you're looking at $4,000 a month just for that bridge portion, plus the other $1,000 a month. So it's $60,000 a year. It's pretty significant. Notice for the lobby. So I have a photo of the restaurant here. Notice, because I think it's kind of that similar thing, right? If you're walking into a restaurant and there's a big giant letter A, you're pretty happy. If it's not a letter A, you might be questioning a little bit, right? So as people are walking into the lobbies of your buildings, if they see the word safe, they're pretty happy. If they see the word swamp, they might be curious and try to look in to see what that means. If they see the word unsafe, they certainly are going to be very, very concerned. And again, that has to be posted in the lobby. FISP checklist. So as we've gone through this process year over year, and you know, people are coming to us, property managers, owners, asking for FISP proposals, we've been kind of noticing some of the things they should be looking for. So we created this FISP checklist, which will be available to you via a link at the end of the presentation. You can download that, print it out, and we recommend that you go through this list and check these items off as you're purchasing FISP services. So to make sure that you have everything that you need, it's clearly laid out there. As you go through it, if you think we missed something, please let us know, of course. But we feel it's pretty comprehensive. Even lays out what you should do if there's unsafe conditions at the building. If you flip that document over, on the back of it is something that we think is good for your people that are on site, your resident managers, your superintendents, your facilities directors that are on site and taking a look at the facilities. The code states that buildings have to be maintained as safe. We recommend that buildings be looked at, the exterior of the building be looked at minimum every month. We understand that's not realistic, so quarterly at minimum with the change of seasons. Take a look at the outside of the building. And we just created a little bit of a checklist of what you want to look for when you're out there, what your superintendent on site should be looking for. Again, you know, it depends on the season sometimes. If the sun beats up on a roof and the UV degradation, you know, really starts to have a roof start to fail, well, that's one thing. Freeze thaw in the winter is going to affect the facade a little bit differently. So those things that we think they should be looking for as they walk around the building to make sure that you're maintaining that building is unsafe. So that's the presentation. We've given this webinar 5 or 6 times now. At the end of it, there's some questions. So I thought we'd just kind of go through those frequently asked questions at the end in case some of you still had those questions. And then we're just about at the point of wrapping up. So the question that comes up a lot, because I talk so fast, is the 8th cycle amnesty available during the entire 9th cycle? No. As of right now, it is available from July to September of 2020. They have done these amnesty programs in the past, and they have not allowed them to continue for the entire cycle. But what they are doing is allowing you to file that 8th cycle report during this window. Or really what you're doing is you're filing your 9th cycle report early to put a stop to the violations. Have you heard that New York City may reduce the height of the buildings that are required to have FISP inspections from over 6 stories to 5 stories? There is talk about that in the industry quite a bit. Whether or not that'll actually happen, I don't know. I do know that it would take it from 14,000 plus buildings in the FISP universe to over 100,000. I think there's merits for it, but I think logistically, it just might be an unreasonable request to try to do that in a shortened time frame. So how they would roll that out, if they were to roll it out, would be difficult and would take a lot of thought, as it would put a tremendous burden on the Department of Buildings as well as the industry at large to jump from 14,000 to 100,000 buildings. As a business owner in this industry, of course, I think it's great. As protecting the public, I think it'd be great if they did that. But I recognize that logistically, it's not that simple. It's just saying, yeah, let's do it. There's much more of an impact there. But I should state that regardless of the height of the building, if it's a 1-story building, by code, you are still required to file, to maintain your building as safe. You don't have to file a report for it. You have to maintain your building as safe. So those building owners less than 6 stories or 6 stories and less shouldn't feel like they have a free pass here. They still are required. So you still want to bring out an experienced engineer and architect, have them look at the outside of the building, make sure there's no unsafe conditions. Certainly something falling from the 4th or 5th floor is going to do quite a bit of damage as well. It doesn't have to be from the 6th or 7th floor. And is there any connection between the various delays from the current pause and the current inspection deadline? So obviously we're talking about New York City on pause due to COVID-19. My understanding and what has been reiterated by the DOB is they are not going to allow that as an excuse because FISP inspections were considered essential throughout the New York City on pause. So we were allowed to go out and do our FISP inspections. Work on unsafe conditions was also considered essential. So now that we're back and non-essential construction is going again, there is enough time certainly to get that report filed. And if you didn't do the work during your previous cycle, stating that you waited until the end and COVID-19 delayed you from being able to get it done, I don't feel that they're going to buy that as an excuse. If you were 1 month from being finished and COVID-19 hit, well, maybe they would buy that, but that's not what we're talking about here. Just saying having not done it at all is not going to be a viable excuse. And in my opinion, and from what I've talked to the DOB about now, that will not be a viable excuse. And the last question we had was, where does the DOB stand on drones? Can they replace close-up inspections? So the DOB is fine with drone use in addition to close-up inspections. Their opinion, and I agree, is there's nothing like getting your hands on a building and really getting that close and looking at it. We've done drone inspections for buildings. They are great. They're not the same thing as getting up close and getting your hands on the building. So I agree with the DOB in that one. It is also difficult to get, because we're in New York City, there's 3 different FAA airspaces from Newark, LaGuardia, and JFK. We did a drone inspection. The first one we did was for a building up in the Bronx. We wanted to do it during the FISP inspection. By the time we got FAA approval was 6 months later. We were already in the middle of construction. So we did it as marketing and just to do some practice, but the time frame just isn't there. Some of the other ones we've been able to do a little bit faster, but you can see how that's just not reasonable to assume to be able to do that from the FAA side, but also from the DOB side, they're not allowing it in lieu of close-up inspections. So thank you very much for your time. I wanted to keep it to an hour. It looks like I went a couple minutes over. I do talk really fast. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. My contact information is in the lower left-hand side of the screen. So it's there. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. Feel free to reach out to anyone at Sullivan Engineering. We will have some attachments included. So the owner-manager FISP checklist that I spoke about in the last slide will be there. Prior newsletter articles related to FISP will be attached as a link to this YouTube video, and then a little bit of our marketing portfolio or a link to our website will be included as well, so that you can have that to take a look at. If there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Even if we are not the engineer and architect that you're working with, if you're happy with the one you're working with, you just have a question for us, we don't need to work on 100% of the buildings in New York City. There are quite a few very good engineers and architects out there great even in the QE space. We're happy to allow you to continue working with them. But if you have a question, we're here to answer and help in any way we can. Thank you very much for your time today. Really appreciate it.